Hello, BookTube. I find myself once again making a response video to Shelley Swearingen. Not just because she also has an adorable miniature schnauzer, but because she keeps making videos that are right in my wheelhouse, things that I love and adore. And she did a video just recently on a subject that has come up a lot for me in my bookish life off of BookTube. I am well known as being a big fan of historical fiction. I've had a number of people over the decades ask me, well, if I wanted to like historical fiction the way you do, you certainly make it sound attractive. Where would I start? I've never read any historical fiction before. In other words, historical fiction for newbies, which is a great subject. Now, in her video, Shelley mentions that there were a bunch of titles that immediately sprang to her mind that she wrote off for the person who asked her about historical fiction for newbies. The first of which was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Shelley's a big fan of the book, but she wrote off Wolf Hall anyway because she thinks it's a little bit sedentary in its pace, and B, maybe more importantly, there's the impression that you probably need to know something about Tudor England history. You probably have to be interested in it ahead of time in order to get the most out of Wolf Hall. And I can definitely see that. We'll be getting to what you... Come here. Come over here. There you go. We'll be getting to what you need to do and not do for historical fiction. But I can definitely see that. I'm a big fan of Wolf Hall, obviously, as you know, if you've watched this channel. I'm a huge fan of the book. But when you're reading along in that book, Hilary Mantel doesn't really go out of her way to explain things to you. She's really got other things on her mind to do. So I suppose it's possible that if you don't know off the top of your head what the Schmalkaldic League was, and just at that moment, Janet Workman perks up. Oh, are we going to talk about the Schmalkaldic League? No, we're not, you nerd. Yeah. If you don't know stuff like that, you might not get it from context. So I guess I understand that. And the same thing is true of another of Shelley's picks, which is The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which is a great novel. It's worth all of the universal praise that it has received, but it's a hugely detailed deep dive into the world of 1930s and 40s comic books, American comic books and comic strips. It's wonderfully literate on that subject, wonderfully aspirational. It is a great book, but I understand why you might not hand that to a newcomer, especially since, in addition to everything else, it's long. And then the third book that she brought up that she would not recommend to a newbie would be The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, which is a murder mystery from almost 100 years ago, where a present-day detective digs into the historical mystery of King Richard III and the princes in the Tower, the so-called princes in the Tower. The death of the princes in the Tower, the eldest son and heir of Richard's brother, the king, and that eldest son and heir's younger brother go into the Tower of London alive and are never seen alive again. They don't come out of it alive. And Alan Grant, Josephine Tey's main character, decides to try to investigate that, the ultimate cold case. And Shelley says that that might not work unless you are predisposed to English history. And we'll come back to that. And then the fourth book that she writes off before she gives her own recommendations is Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks. It's a short piece of historical fiction in which a medieval village is stricken with the bubonic plague. And what happens? What happens as a result of that? And her reason for warning off a newcomer that way is that it's in between its bursts of found humanity or hard-edged compassion, it is physically grotesque. It is a bitter pill of a book to swallow, and maybe that would disenchant a newcomer to the subgenre. So, okay. All right. So those are the ones that she rules out before she makes 3 recommendations of her own. And I'm going to leave a link to her video. You should go to her video to see her recommendations. See what you think of them. But it got me thinking. It got me thinking about historical fiction. I don't need much prompting to think about historical fiction. It got me thinking about how you recommend historical fiction. I have been doing that for a long, long time. And I have had 2 guiding, I don't want to say warnings, but 2 guiding precepts for anybody who wants to be a newcomer to historical fiction. One is the simple necessity of preparation. I hate to say it, I always say, and I firmly believe that that novels should carry their own worlds with them. You shouldn't need to do, like if you have an annotated version of a classic, you shouldn't need the annotations in order to understand the inspiration of the book. But you might need annotations to understand the context of the book. That could happen. And historical fiction is all about context. Now, writers often get around the imposition on the reader of extracurricular reading by dumping all of their research into their book. And that tends to give historical fiction a bad name. I understand that reflex. That reflex comes from 2 places. One is that writers have done all this research themselves, and they don't want to have suffered alone. So they just back the truck up and dump their index cards into the book. And 2 is that they want their book to be self-sufficient. They don't want to lose readers in chapter 2 when all of a sudden those readers realize they don't know what's going on. I understand why writers do that. Some of them do it much worse than others. Some of them are much worse offenders than others. Some of them turn that process into an endurance contest to separate the wheat from the chaff. Famously, Moby Dick is not a historical novel when Melville wrote it, but famously it is an example of a book that carries all of its exposition with it. So that technically you don't need to know anything about the 19th century industry of whaling in order to set yourself perfectly up. And I could name a whole bunch of other historical novels that do that same thing. They inform you as they go along, and that partly accounts for their length. A whole bunch of examples come to mind. I have Shogun comes to mind. Is a perfect example. You do not need to study the shogunate period. You do not need to study medieval Japan in order to get everything possible out of this book. But you pay the price for that because it's 1,000 pages long. So, in order to do that for you, and Clavel does it really well, he does it really smoothly, but in order to do that for you, you are going to run into the second characteristic of historical fiction that just has to be laid on the table for newcomers. The first one is the information gap. Reading up on the subject, on the Schmalkaldic League. Reading up on the subject. Now, you can either meet that obstacle by just resigning yourself to the fact that you're going to be getting all of that stuff in relatively undigested format in the book, or you can do the reading ahead of time. It's never been any easier to do that than it is now. You have Wikipedia on your phone. You have this vast, free, peer-reviewed, peer-checked information source on your phone. So, for instance, to use Shelley's example of Wolf Hall, you know that the novel is about Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's lawyer and chief leg breaker. You know that it's about Thomas Cromwell, that first book is about Thomas Cromwell. So you could go to Wikipedia and read about Thomas Cromwell. Read the whole, read all the connected articles, then read the main article again. Read it until you feel like you know it. You could do the same thing with medieval shogunate until you're more familiar with the background information of the book than you were originally. You could do that. But the second obstacle is length. Historical novelists love to go on and on and on. They love to do that. So most of the most beloved historical novels in history have been immensely long. There's this, I would say there's no way around it, but it's not like anyone's trying to avoid it. Most readers of historical fiction like a big fat doorstop. I have a couple of examples. Ian Pierce wrote a gigantic murder mystery called An Instance of the Finger Post. This is huge, and it is multiple people, each telling roughly the same story, but from their own viewpoint. Which means you're going over the ground many times in the course of this book, and none of these characters feel particularly obliged to explain everything. They're explaining their own worlds, their own part of the events in the story, in the one story that unites all the parts of the book, but they're not explaining anybody else's part in it. And that makes for a very long book and a very historically buried book. You are buried in exposition in this book, but oh my, does it have a payoff. Oh my, the mother of all payoffs. Because by the end of the book, you, the reader, are coming to understand what actually happened in a couple of the main plot lines that run throughout the book. You are coming to understand what actually happened. And it's heartbreaking. It's a thrilling process. It's a very slow process, but it's thrilling. But it's also heartbreaking. You, by the end of the book, you know more than any of the other characters do. But you have to go through, however long it is, 800 pages in order to get there. And then there's perhaps one of the two most famous historical novels of all time. A historical novel so famous that people forget it's a historical novel. And that's War and Peace by Tolstoy. In which Tolstoy is writing about history from 50 or 60 years in the past. War and Peace is legendary. It has become synonymous with both a difficult book and a long book, even though there are longer books and far more difficult books. I would argue that in its own way, An Instance of the Finger Post is far more difficult than War and Peace, and designed to be so. But War and Peace is perhaps the signature example of the way historical fiction just goes on and on and on, where historical fiction writers, a lot of them in the history of the subgenre, have just not been content with the welterweight of 500 pages. They just have not been content with that. And the same thing is true for the other of what I think are probably the two most famous works of historical fiction today. People don't know that War and Peace is historical fiction, but they know the name War and Peace. Whereas really famous historical novels from a bygone generation, like Quo Vadis or The Robe, are forgotten now. So it won't matter. Ben-Hur is forgotten now, so no one remembers them, so you can't bring them up. But there is another piece of historical fiction that is not forgotten. It is handed down from generation to generation. It is in book clubs. It is alive as a book, amazingly. Probably because it has a towering film adaptation, but the book also is alive. I know this for a fact. I have talked over decades and decades and decades. I have talked to people who are... their mothers hadn't been born when this book came out, and they still love it. And that is Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. And the problem, Gone with the Wind is very long, and it is spellbinding. It's much more spellbinding than An Instance of the Finger Post. It's, I would say, on par with Shogun for how it yanks you into the story and just keeps you turning pages. The only difference, the main difference here, and it's not something you'd usually hear me say on this channel, but nevertheless, it's unavoidable, is that this is... I don't deny its storytelling power. It is magical. A lot of you who are listening to me, the minute you hear historical fiction come up, this is the book you think about. A lot of you were introduced to this when you were young, probably by an aunt or a mother or a grandmother who was introduced to it when they were young and loved it. And you read it and loved it. I understand that. I'm not trying to undermine that at all. But I'm not going to use the stupid 21st century word problematic. This is an evil book. It's steeped to its eyeballs in racism. There is no way to avoid that. None at all. And I hope that we can agree, or at least we can talk about it. that when we go on here on BookTube about separating the art from the artist, okay, fine. I actually, to a limited degree, maybe more than limited degree, I agree with that. It would not make as much of a difference to me if Margaret Mitchell were simply racist. But that isn't Gone with the Wind. I know it's hard to say for a lot of you. I fell under this book spell myself a long, long time ago. I fell out of that spell, but I fell under it for a long, long time ago. You only have to go through one civil rights movement to fall out of love with this book, I think. At least I didn't need more than the one a long, long time ago. But this isn't a case of Margaret Mitchell being racist. This is a case of Margaret Mitchell writing a racist book. So it's long, sure, and it builds a whole world and it pulls you in like Shogun or Lonesome Dove, but it's not the same. And it takes more special handling. I don't know. That's probably the subject for another video. But those books, I chose Gone with the Wind because it's a signature thing and it's famously long. I'm adding the parenthetical mainly because the minute I saw it, I thought about it, which is it's spellbinding, it's page-turning reading, it's incredibly long and involving, and you shouldn't read it. It's soilingly racist. Anyway, those books, I mainly chose them to illustrate the second obstacle to introducing a newbie to historical fiction, which is that historical fiction tends to be really long. And most of the books that I've talked about here, have quite a bit to recommend them. If you can deal with the length, they have quite a bit to recommend them. But I want to make some recommendations of my own for historical fiction for newbies. And I want to start with something that it looks like I'm picking a fight with Shelley Swearingen, but I'm not. I want to start with something she rejected, which is The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey. I think that this requires a lot less starting interest or knowledge of English history than Shelley's giving the impression. I think that's why it's so unbelievably popular, why it has stayed so popular for so long. It not only doesn't require that knowledge, but it relies on you not having that knowledge. It relies on you not having any more knowledge than Alan Grant has when he is laid up in the hospital, which is precisely zero. He knows what he remembers from the schoolroom, and that's it. About Richard III and the Princes in the Tower, he remembers almost nothing. And so he has to learn it all, and so do his readers. This book has created more history buffs than any other book in history. I would argue this book has created more actual historians than any other book in history. People who read this and realized, oh, wow. So digging into the sources and untangling what actually happened in the past, or at least what's most likely, is not only interesting, it's fascinating. I think that made a lot of historians. And it's specifically premised on the fact that you don't need knowledge going in. Grant only vaguely remembers that Richard III is a bad guy, that he learned that from Shakespeare, not from history, and that Richard III probably killed his nephews, the princes in the tower. That's all he really knows when he's going in here. We are expected to learn with him. And I think it really works. I think it really does. I don't agree with it at all. I don't agree with a single word of it. But it does work, I think, better than the impression that you may get from Shelley's video. So it would be one of the books that I would use and have used in the past as an entry point for history fiction newcomers. Then another way to entice a newbie to historical fiction is with a great character. A lot of times historical fiction doesn't do that. That is one of the things that Wolf Hall does really well. Wolf Hall not only gives you a great character, but he was a real person. The version of Thomas Cromwell that Hilary Mantel creates was not a real person at all. Not at all. But her creation is completely real, completely three-dimensional. Oh my God, an amazing thing. And the same thing is true of this next recommendation of mine, which is Restoration by Rose Tremaine, which is about, again, like Wolf Hall, it's a book entirely built around the one main character, a physician in Restoration London, who, much like in Wolf Hall, flies really close to the sun, comes to know the king, King Charles II. and then has a fall, a pretty steep fall that he keeps falling for most of the book, and it's gripping. The best thing Rose Tremaine ever wrote. And in this one, the draw will be the character. But another draw that you will have for historical fiction for a newbie is if they basically already know the story, right? I mean, if you give them a historical novel, again, I'm sorry, I keep teasing Janet Wertman, but if you give them a historical novel about the Schmalkaldic League, they're not going to have any idea of their bearings. None at all. Now, they can correct that on Wikipedia, but for the absolute newbie, it would be better if that were organic. So if you hand an absolute newbie a novel about Anne Boleyn, for instance, well, somebody who only remembers the thumbnail history they learned in school will still probably remember that Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn beheaded. They might not remember anything other than that, but they'll know that. Same thing with a good historical novel about Abraham Lincoln. There hasn't been one. There hasn't been one. But if there ever is one, that would be another example. Everyone knows, every American knows at least something about Abraham Lincoln, or they think they do. And that can also be true not just of the character, but also of events. So if you have a great novel about the American Revolution, for instance, there hasn't been one, but if there were one, you know how the American Revolution comes out. You know who wins and who loses. The average American polled on the sidewalk does not know that, but if you're a bookish person, you do. The average American on the sidewalk, if you ask them who won the American Revolution, would either draw a blank or have a 50-50 chance of giving you the wrong answer, which once upon a time was a source of national fun and amusement. Now it's a source of deep national embarrassment, because one of the people who would give you either a blank look or the wrong answer is the current president of the United States. But for book readers, no, they know at least that, and so they'll feel the ground a little bit firmer underneath them, and that informs my next recommendation, which is Pompeii by Richard Harris, or Robert Harris. Richard Harris couldn't write 2 sentences, but Robert Harris wrote a novel about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of the city of Pompeii. Now, you might not know anything about that, but you know what happens. You know what's coming. At the end of a book about Pompeii, you know what's coming. Some authors can play with that a lot, like Elodie Harper in her Wolf's books, but the authors who don't play with it tend to just make it the unacknowledged co-writer of their story, the thing that is going to provide the dramatic oomph at the end. Whether it's in the Victorian era, an author writing the single worst novel ever written in the English language, it's really, really bad, but one of the things that's keeping its minimal dramatic tension alive is the fact that you know what's coming. You, the reader, know what's coming. And Harris is the same way. He does the same thing here. Not with the hoi polloi of Pompeii, but with a working hydraulist, as a waterman who has been sent from Rome to figure out what's going on with the aqueduct. Now, Robert Harris starts every chapter with geological information about volcanic eruptions. Modern geological information about volcanic eruptions. Every chapter's epigraph is something like that. So, which is a canny decision, because you might not know all that. You know what's coming, but you want to know the details that weren't known at the time. One of which is that volcanic eruptions are preceded by many earthquakes. That would shatter subterranean water pipes. That would shatter or fracture. It would spring big leaks in viaducts. That would be why the water table is destroyed, because there were earthquakes prior to the eruption. Now, in this novel, the characters are very much secondary to that information, to this impending, mind-boggling catastrophe. But it still works. Oh my, does it ever. It still works. In fact, it works even more. Edward Bulwer-Lytton, the author of The Last Days of Pompeii, knew precious little about how volcanoes work. But Harris has studied it to a fare thee well. And he imparts that knowledge to you. That's going to make a newbie feel a lot more grounded. They're still going to have to learn about the Roman terms and whatnot, but still. Then getting back to historical events that the reader might know or be able to really brush up on really quickly, you might think that that would be the main selling point of this next book, but it's not. It's the writing that is the main selling point of The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. This is a novel about the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War, where General Lee and his army, his Confederate army, marched north into Pennsylvania and were met there by a Union army, and there was an epic battle unfolded over the course of days. And I know Civil War guys will tell me that it's overly simplistic to say this, but it broke the back of the Confederacy. Now, you know, even if you don't know Civil War history, you know the South lost. You know Lee lost the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge. You know that even if you don't know any of the other details. You know that he lost. So you know what's coming. And that can add ground under your feet, but the main draw of this book is how beautifully it's written. This is... there are no other works of fiction. This is a work of historical fiction, but there are no other works of fiction, historical or otherwise, where I have handed them to people cold and said, if you're looking for a piece of fiction that you will love, read this. And if you don't love it, I'll buy it back from you. I am 100% sure you will love it. I did that for 25 years in a retail bookstore. No one ever called me on it. No one ever brought it back to me. I had plenty of customers who would have. I had plenty of customers who were actually angry that they couldn't call me on it. And I never did that. Never thought of doing that for any contemporary fiction. And not because I expected all my customers to be up on Civil War history, but because of how beautifully this is done. So it definitely gets a recommend, even if you know the subject matter. And then we can finish up here with this last book, which is it's terse, it's tense, it's icy. It's set in the second, 1829, I think, or 1828. So right, still at the beginning of the 19th century in Iceland. It's Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. And it's the story of a woman who has been convicted of murder and has been sentenced to death. The last person to be sentenced to death in Iceland. But she's being held prior to her sentence being called out in a farmstead. And it's a weird, shadowy time in her life because she's neither alive nor dead. That doesn't sound appealing, but Hannah Kent does a magnificent job with this. And this is the opposite kind of historical fiction for newbies than most of the other stuff that I've mentioned. Maybe it is most similar to Restoration. Most Americans who are not history fans or historical fiction fans wouldn't be able to tell you much of anything about Restoration London. Probably not anything. They would need to be brought up to speed on a lot of it. And likewise, no reader is going to know anything about 19th century Iceland. So maybe it shares a lot there. You know, the Josephine Tay, The Murder of the Princess in the Tower, Richard III. Everybody knows Richard III from Shakespeare, even if they don't know the so-called mystery of the Princess in the Tower. I don't think there's any mystery about what happened to them, but nevertheless. And the same thing is true with Pompeii and the Killer Angels. Those are signature historical events. This is a historical footnote. But boy, oh boy, I would still hand this to a historical fiction newbie because of how well it's done. How bracingly, like an ice bath, it's done. Will pull you in. And once you're pulled in, I believe you'll be stuck with historical fiction. It really is habit forming. So Shelley's video and this video, I want to strongly urge those of you who've never tried historical fiction to try it. Because it really does stick with you. You will like it. And once you're adept at historical fiction, it will be but a skip and a jump to move to nonfiction. To move to nonfiction. The Killer Angels is absolutely terrific. Bruce Catton writing about the Civil War, nonfiction history about the Civil War, is absolutely terrific. Pompeii is set in ancient Rome. It is a novel. It is really, really good. Stacy Schiff's biography of Cleopatra is set in ancient Rome. It is a biography, and it is really, really good. Once you get a little bit closer in, you'll start to see that. If you have reservations about historical fiction, I believe these newbie choices will solve it for you. I think even A Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks would solve it for you. And if you have even bigger hang-ups about reading nonfiction, history, biography, that sort of thing, well, you'll be that much closer along. So anyway, there you go. There's another Shelley Swearingen response video. I just couldn't leave historical fiction for newbies. I couldn't leave that alone. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, both.